All right, guys, our next speaker came all the way from Juneau to talk to us today. He's got over 2 decades fighting for fish habitat. I'll let him explain most of his accolades, but Jon Warrenchuk from Oceana. Jon, thanks for being here.
So by way of introduction, I've lived up in Alaska here for about 25 years. I moved up to go to grad school, moved to Juneau. I went to the School of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences through UAF, but it's based in Juneau, Alaska. My professor sent me out into the Bering Sea during the last year of the open access snow crab fishery to collect some snow crab for a laboratory experiment where we were doing an experiment on discard mortality, how well they survive after you throw them back in the water. And I quickly found out that this was not necessarily the work for me. Looking up at waves instead of, across or down at a wave wasn't exactly my idea of a good time. This was the whole ice freezing on the boat and everything. So, when I was making grad student money and I was watching the crab crew making $70,000 a year, I kind of thought I was in the wrong business. But after grad school, and then I found myself working for this group called Oceana. So Oceana, like the Outdoor Council, we're a nonprofit. We're not as old as the Outdoor Council, of course. Oceana's been around for around 20 years, which is almost as long as I've been working for the group. And we have offices all over the world, actually. It's one of the larger ocean conservation groups. I'm based in Juneau. My work is mostly on the industrial fisheries in the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska. And much like the last presentation, Alaska's ocean, Alaska's fisheries, it's a mishmash of jurisdictions and agencies. I don't know how well you can see that, but my work overlaps all these types of agencies. The North Pacific Fishery Management Council, which gives advice to the Fisheries Service on the federal offshore fisheries, offshore 3 nautical miles from state waters. And of course, the Alaska Board of Fish handles salmon and inshore type of fisheries. And then there's the Halibut Commission, which is an international body. And what you'll typically see in those, especially at the North Pacific Council and the federal arena, is a lot of pride around the volume of fish that gets produced from Alaska. This is I stole this slide actually from the Alaska Bycatch Task Force presentations that were given by the leader of the Fishery Service at the time. And you can see, I don't know how well you can see that, but we're talking billions of dollars and billions of pounds of fish caught and removed from Alaska waters every year. The volume of it is stuff called ground fish, which are your pollock and flatfish and rockfish. And I don't know how this term ground fish came up, but I think it has to do with, eventually this all gets ground up to be turned into fish sticks, right? So this is where you get your fish sticks from, pollock. And one thing I want to draw attention to here is the different size of the pies and the pie charts. So on your left, my right, your left, I can't tell, but you can see that the poundage of something like pollock, it's massive. They catch billions of pounds. The value is a little lower though, so on a per pound basis, pollock isn't as valuable as, say, salmon. Salmon is actually our most valuable fishery. And one thing you don't notice on these types of charts that the Fisheries Service usually presents, they're only talking about commercial fisheries value. So it's a little harder to get into the values of what subsistence or what charter and recreational, or just even the ability to live here in Alaska and catch your own fish and how much value that brings to the state. And so typically, the Fishery Service or the council will show this type of chart and say, okay, well, what's the problem with fisheries management in Alaska? We have some of the best in the world. And I don't know if this is lost on anyone, Mad Magazine. What's the problem? What me worry about this? Well, this kind of thing has been in the news a lot lately, as you've probably heard. Fishery closures all over the state. some of our most iconic fisheries, crab, Chinook salmon, halibut in decline. So there is problems going on offshore there. And not to pin all the blame on the industrial offshore trawl fleet, but this has contributed to some of these declines and is certainly part of the solution that we can address. You know, we can't necessarily change the climate, but we can control how many fish we kill and catch, right? We have a pretty simple mantra, which is count everything and everything counts. This was a quote actually from the former administrator, former leader of the fisheries service in a recent newspaper article. He basically says, well, you know, catching that much fish out of the Alaska ecosystem is bound to have some effects. And well, where did this really start? Here's a picture I dragged up. This is trawling in Alaska is actually not that old. It hasn't been going on very long. It really only started in the 50s when foreign factory processors came into the Bering Sea in the Gulf of Alaska and started targeting these offshore stocks. Alaska's always had these iconic salmon fisheries, halibut fisheries, small boat cod fisheries, and this entry of large boats dragging nets along the seafloor to catch fish was a relatively new concept, at least for Alaska. And you can kind of see, this is a flatfish vessel. Here's, you know, you can see the iconic outline of a halibut. Of course, the halibut tail is easy to see there, a big halibut on deck. And so obviously the problem with high volume fishing is something called bycatch, which is the unintentional catch of stuff you didn't want to catch. I don't know how well you can see this, but it's also in the report I handed out around the table. And this little graphic is just to give you a sense of the scope and scale of what these industrial trawl vessels, what they look like and what kind of gear they use. And so what I'm talking about here is trawls, not trolls, not trolling. This is trawling, T-R-A-W-L, which it's a mobile towed gear, and it can be massive. So this is a little graphic of a factory trawler, and it's towing a trawl net. This is a hard-on bottom called bottom trawl net, and you know, it's wire cables attached to some steel doors, which may gouge into the seafloor. And then there's these long, what they call sweeps. They can be up to 1,000 feet long. And the intent of those is to kind of herd the fish towards the net. You know, and they kind of kick up a plume of sediment. And then when you get to the mouth of the net might be 200 feet wide. The foot rope kind of rolls and bounces along the seafloor, and then the whole net itself could be 300 or 400 feet long. Big gear. And then if you just kind of pictured yourself ducking underwater and this is like a fisheye view of this net coming at you. Here's the steel doors that might be dragging along the bottom. The foot rope, which might have roller gear to kind of bounce it along the seafloor, and just a little graphic of all the fish and invertebrates that might be on the bottom. And then behind could be furrows, gouges, and it's really the only kind of fishing gear that leaves the habitat in worse a shape than it was before. And these may be, well, here's a little video of some in action. These aren't necessarily commercial tows. These might be research tows of a trawl, but you kind of get the idea of how they operate. You can see that along the bottom here. Oh, there's a rock going over. And they call these rock hopper gear, and it allows them to access a little more rugged habitats. But they'll be dragging these nets for miles along the bottom, and cumulatively it can affect acres, thousands of acres per tow. Here's another little video. This is a pollock pelagic net. It's called pelagic. However, it does actually spend a significant amount of time on the seafloor as well. And these pollock nets are even bigger. They may be 100 feet tall. And you can see that the idea is just basically to sieve the ocean and accumulate the fish in the cod end of the net. You can see the pollock up there as they get more and more dense in the end of the net, which is called the cod end. Yeah, and it starts to get pretty tight in there. But that's the idea. These are low value fish and you need to catch a lot of them to be making money. Here's a little video that's popped up on social media a few times. Kind of disgusts me. One thing I think most Alaskans can understand is that wasting fish is not a good thing. I don't know what happened for this particular trawl boat, but it looks like it ended up at the dock. Maybe it ripped its net or something, because I see a guy doing a net repair. But all these fish that are stuck in the net, sometimes, I mean, they call that drop off or mid-net counting. And the Fisheries Service says they do count those fish, but basically those are fish that are wasted. And as I look, you see commercially valuable and sport desirable fish, sable fish, other things in this net. So it's a fairly non-selective practice. And of course, what's been in the news is salmon bycatch. Salmon is obviously an iconic and important species for Alaska, and it is salmon that finds itself sometimes in the path of these pollock trawl nets. And while the catches of pollock are quite large compared to the amount of bycatch of salmon that does occur, the scope and scale of pollock fishing means that all this, even if it's a small percentage of the bycatch, does add up to some significant numbers. But through the years, and I've been going to these fishery meetings for 20 years now, we have convinced the Fisheries Service and the Council to institute some hard caps, limits. I mean, it shouldn't have been a foreign concept to have limits on how much you can catch, but it was a long time coming. So in this example here, these are actual regulations that have been put in place on the pollock fishery and other fisheries after some justifiable outrage in 2007 when the pollock fishery caught an estimated 120,000 Chinook salmon in the Bering Sea. A couple years later, we got a hard cap limit in place that would actually close the pollock fishery if they hit that amount, and hit the amount of 60,000 fish with some lower incentive caps of 47,000 fish. And since then, they've never come that close to the cap. In the Gulf of Alaska, following on the Bering Sea, we got a cap in place of 25,000 fish after they hit a maximum of 44,000 Chinook. And then in another fishery that targets flat fishing cod with their hard on the bottom trawls, a smaller cap of 7,500 fish. I saw a question in the back there. Yes. True. Good question. And in most of the fisheries, in many of the fisheries, like the pollock fishery is 100% observed. So every one of the boats does carry one or even two fishery observers. And now they're also putting video cameras on some of the boats as well. In the Gulf of Alaska, however, there's a lower percentage of observer coverage. And in fact, there's only about 1 out of 5 trips covered by an observer. So those estimates, there's a little more uncertainty with those estimates. But I will say, you do hear, through the grapevine, a lot of anecdotal reports of fish being hidden from observers, or them not noticing, or them not making it into their sample basket. And I'm sure the reality is somewhere in between Fishery Services estimated some higher number. But even with these numbers, though, I will say, you know, we can't pin all of the problems on the trawl fleet itself. Like this amount of salmon bycatch, you know, didn't cause the decline, long-term decline of salmon in Alaska, but it did and is still contributing to it. I think we're getting to the point where every Chinook salmon counts now, because you know, it's looking pretty grim for that kind of species that needs to spend 6 years in the ocean escaping all the predators and trawl nets that are sieving through some of their preferred feeding habitat. Sure.
There's no lack of theories about what's happened to the Alaskan salmon. What's the magnitude of this problem? How is it
Well, the Fishery Services estimates on bycatch, so they, let's see, I think I have a next slide here. You probably can't see those too well, but I did mention the Chinook salmon limit. In the Bering Sea, there's no limit for chum salmon. And chum salmon, especially for Western Alaska, Yukon, is a very important, they're very important runs, you know, and they're actually a very premium chum. You know, they're pretty oily, and communities and villages up and down the Yukon rely on them heavily. But to date, there's been no limit on how much could be incidentally taken as bycatch. So they're going through analyses to look at different numbers and what kind of things they could do. The Fishery Services estimates of how much this bycatch has affected returns are on the level of 1 to 5%, which doesn't seem like much at the time. However, I think there's some different assumptions that you can make around the way they sample for the genetic makeup of the bycatch. They tend to combine all the sampling together, and then that gets you high percentages of Asian hatchery chum in the bycatch. But I think if you hone in on some of these areas where a lot of the bycatch is occurring, like right here outside of Unimak Pass, Dutch Harbor, you know, this is where just on the other side, the Area M fishery is having big problems with interception of salmon going to Western Alaska streams. So, you know, I might have a different opinion of how much of that Chinook and chum were actually bound for Alaska streams there. And, you know, maybe the chum and Chinook from up there were hatchery fish going to Russia. But right now, the Fishery Service combines it all, so the effect doesn't seem that much. However, I still think we're getting close to every fish counts, and when you can manage some fishing mortality, you know, we need to take the opportunity to do so. Okay, halibut. Halibut's another big bycatch problem for these groundfish fisheries. This is a kind of a trend series from the International Halibut Commission. Pretty cool. It goes all the way back to the 1900s. You know, this is one of our oldest iconic fisheries. Halibut catches, commercial catches were steady for years and years and years until, you know, what happened here around the 1960s when these factory trawlers moved in to the Bering Sea and Gulf of Alaska. The orange here is the estimate of what that incidental halibut bycatch mortality was. And well, you think we would have solved the problem by getting rid of the foreign factory trawlers, but you know, we simply replaced it with American factory trawlers. And so this orange, the orange discard mortality is remained fairly steady over the years. And you can see that it's larger than the directed recreational fishery or subsistence fishery combined. And nowadays it's getting close to, you know, it's a larger proportion of the directed fishery catch itself. And in the Bering Sea, the bycatch of halibut actually exceeds the size of the halibut fishery itself. I'll just skip this. And one of the great ironies of this is that most of the halibut bycatch in the Bering Sea, at least, comes from an area that's closed to halibut fishing for halibut fishermen. It's close to the commercial halibut fishery, because way back in the 20s, they identified this zone as a halibut nursery area, that there was a lot of juvenile halibut in this area. So it's close to halibut fishing, but it's open to trawling. And this is where most of the halibut bycatch in the Bering Sea comes from, is this region right off of Dutch Harbor, Unimak Pass. Even actually during the foreign factory trawl days, the Japanese put this area aside also for king crab, and it was a pot sanctuary. But now it's turned into something called Cod Alley. Trawl away. Most heavily trawled area in Alaska. So here's a little example. This is in the Gulf around Kodiak. And the kind of work that I do, which is promoting transparency around fisheries management, federal fisheries management. And here's a little exercise we did where, if you can see this, we partnered with a group called Global Fishing Watch, which gathers the satellite data from the, it's called AIS system that certain size fishing boats are required to have on their vessels. And we could, using some models, plot where the beginning and the ending of tow tracks were. And so these little lines on the map are your most heavily trawled areas around Kodiak and in the Gulf of Alaska. You can see that there are some areas that are targeted more than others. There's some scratch fishing going on here and there. But then this next slide here, the colors indicate hotspots for halibut bycatch. And so you can see that there are some areas, little pockets there where most of the halibut bycatch occurs. You can overlay that, moving into cooking right here. And you can see how, well, over the years, millions of pounds of halibut's been removed from that area, discarded, killed, while targeting these other species with trawl. And this is just a little schematic. Of course, this is the problem because we're allowing trawling in critical habitats for halibut. This green area here, halibut nursery zone, any of this shallow shelf area is important habitat for those juvenile halibut. And the irony with halibut too is once halibut get past a certain size, they're pretty immune to predation, and nothing usually can kill them. So taking them at this stage really decreases the harvestable biomass, the spawning biomass down the road. It's a source of predation or a source of mortality that we should certainly try to mitigate more. And when you're allowing trawling in the Gulf here, right in this critical nursery habitat or in spawning habitat off the shelf, it's a problem. Now, part of the problem too is it's the International Halibut Commission that manages halibut and things like spawning habitat and stuff, not the Fishery Service. So here's an example. I know that the title of my talk was the cost of trawling. So here is an example specifically for the Gulf of Alaska of the amount of halibut value lost as discarded bycatch just from the directed trawl fisheries. This is the kind of information that's available. It's shorthand because this is just commercial value. So never mind how many charter boats or other kinds of directed users you could support with this amount of halibut if it was left in the ocean. But to target flatfish, which is valued at a few cents a pound, in some years they've thrown away over $9 million worth of halibut. I cite one example in that report I put around the tables. It's a targeted arrowtooth flounder fishery worth around $6 million, and they throw away $9 million worth of halibut. And of course, it's not limited to halibut and salmon. There's a whole suite of other species that these vessels discard when they're catching these large volumes of their targeted species. It's not a large number of vessels, This little schematic here, there's 11 factory trawlers, and this is an example specifically for the Gulf that come up from Seattle every year. All these vessels are based in Seattle, by the way, the factory trawlers. And there's a larger, smaller boat trawl catcher vessel fleet that around 50 or so are based, or maybe 40 are based in Kodiak, a couple in Sandpoint, and then a bunch that come up from Seattle and Newport, Oregon. There's a sizable Oregon trawl catcher vessel fleet. But these handful of vessels average around 24 million pounds of discarded dead bycatch a year. You can go down the list from rockfish, flatfish, pollock, halibut, sablefish, sharks, cod, salmon, crab, and then even things like grow on the bottom, like your things that actually form structure, habitat forming invertebrates. And of course, you're not limited to those marine mammals. This was a picture that was circulated on social media of orca, obviously, actually an orca and its calf, both dead in the net. This is from looks like an arrow-toothed flounder or Pacific Ocean perch trawl. And the irony here is that, there's around 6 to 8 orcas a year killed directly by trawl. And, I live in Juneau in Southeast Alaska, where the Alaska troll fishery that targets Chinook salmon is at risk of being shut down because of interactions between the salmon they catch and whether or not that salmon should be prey food for the endangered orcas down south. This particular subpopulation of orcas that's in this net dead is not endangered, so the trawlers are allowed to catch, I think, up to 15 or 30 of them without being penalized. But whatever, delicious irony, right? So they're targeting, have you ever caught these, arrow-toothed flounder? Whenever I'm fishing halibut, I always catch these ugly things, but this is what they're targeting sometimes, these arrow-toothed flounder, and it's for export. I did a little project with a intern where we started to follow the supply chain. So you can buy this flounder in Walmart. It's labeled as wild caught in Alaska, product of China, because it's sent to China for processing. So the factory trawlers catch arrow-toothed flounder, it's headed and gutted on board, frozen in containers, and then sent to China for further processing. Why do we do that here in Alaska? Well, it's I guess cheaper for the companies to do that. There's less environmental standards in China, less labor laws, it's cheaper. And then the irony is, though, some of this product makes its way back into the US as these great value frozen flounder fillets. And this isn't the only brand. I don't want to just pick on this brand. Well, is this really the stuff that we're going to feed the world with? Well, I don't know. I mean, what's left to catch in Alaska is, at one point, these were called trash fish, right? They couldn't find any use for them, but processors developed a way to, if you've ever tried to cook and eat an arrow-toothed flounder, it turns to mush in the pan because there's this parasite that enzyme that dissolves the meat. Pretty gross, but processors figured out if you soak it in sodium triphosphate, which is kind of a detergent, it retains the moisture. So I did a little experiment to see, well, how much, I actually bought some of this, and how much fish do you actually end up with? Because a lot of the industry's argument is, well, we're trying to provide a source of cheap fish, cheap protein, for families who can't afford it. And so, I understand that, but I also wanted to see, well, how much bang for the buck do you really get out of this kind of product? We bought a 1 kilogram bag of, or how much, what was the weight? Oops. was it 1 kilogram? Anyways, once you cook it, you end up with a lot less meat just because of all that sodium triphosphate, which plumps it up with moisture. Not to mention, this stuff is individually wrapped in non-recyclable plastic. You end up with about 7 square feet from this little $5 bag or $6 bag you can buy at Walmart. So, not the best example of fisheries sustainability or ocean resource development for the state of Alaska. Which really annoys me. To switch gears a little bit, we talked about bycatch, that's kind of an easy thing, counting the fish and counting how much you throw away. But then what about the cost of changing the habitat itself after trawling? This is well known to science that dragging gear along the seafloor changes the structure of the seafloor. It reduces the complexity and the productivity and the biodiversity. And, there's management recommendations with how to deal with this, which includes less trawling, effort reduction, closing areas to trawling, or modifying the gear. And all three of these kinds of approaches have been applied in Alaska, but we certainly have not arrived at a comprehensive solution yet. So here's an example of seafloor structure. And this is the type of stuff that you lose when there is trawling, heavily trawled areas. It's the first habitat feature that you lose is any sort of non-mobile benthic structure forming invertebrates. And some of these are quite old, long-lived. Here's a picture of red tree corals in Glacier Bay National Park, and these are actually juvenile pollock circling around the, this is a cool picture. I've actually had the opportunity to dive in submarines, to go down. This is one of my highlights of my career, diving on seamounts in the Gulf of Alaska to look at what undisturbed, untrawled habitat looks like. And it's, it's pretty amazing actually to be able to look up at deep sea corals. And these could be hundreds of years old. You see a golden king crab hanging out in that coral thicket there. And this type of habitat, it's not everywhere. It can be kind of patchy, and this is why identifying where these kind of habitats are and putting them off limits to trawling seems like a good management approach. Here's a little set of ridges in the middle of the Bering Sea, 330 feet deep. You can see a really complex structured habitat, not the kind of area that you'd want to allow trawling into. This was from an expedition just this spring that I got to charter a vessel out of Kodiak, and we found this little bump on Snakehead Bank around 80 miles offshore. You can see lingcod here hanging around, deep sea corals. I mean, fish like structure,
Basically, if that's straight clean, then that would affect the juvenile salmon survival rate.
Sorry?
If that's straight clean, that would have a detrimental effect on the juvenile salmon survival rate.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. And what kind of habitat do juvenile salmon need during those years at sea? And so far, at least in the near shore, structure is probably good for juvenile salmon to hide and feed in. It's hard to say what they're doing out in the middle of the Bering Sea because you don't see them necessarily down near the seafloor. But the food web is all interconnected here, and I've sampled deep sea corals which have had 1,000 shrimp living on them. So more three-dimensional structure on the seafloor just means more habitat, and the salmon can be eating that prey. Other kinds of fish can be hiding from predators in that kind of habitat. Well, this doesn't seem to be working. These are sea whips. Oh, there it is. This is another kind of deep sea coral, but it's more of a flexible structure. I don't know if any of you have caught these when fishing, but they're a colonial coral related to, they're a softer coral, but they're still a fairly, with a rigid central rod. These can be knocked over by trawls as well. And these live in the softer sediments. So those other structure-forming corals, they might be in the harder bottom habitats. And then this is probably the most diverse area of deep sea coral habitat in Alaska, which is out in the Aleutian Islands. This is almost completely covered with sponges and corals, and there's a great big cod there. Clearly the kind of habitat you wouldn't want to allow trawling in.
Do you have a video of what the bottom looked like after it was grown?
I have some pictures, and one of the things that we do lack is when you drop a camera or go down with an ROV, definitively being able to tell what it looked like before trawling occurred there. Because I've looked at a lot of seafloor video, which expanses of mud or sand with the odd sponge sticking up here and there, and sometimes it'd be hard to tell whether that's just because that's what the habitat looks like always, or was it more structurally complex before trawling was allowed in there. I mean, trawling has occurred off of Alaska for 50 or 60 years, but that's still a relatively short time frame compared to many places in the world, like off the East Coast, where there's been, trawl fisheries for 200, 300 years. So, we're looking for these pockets that are still relatively untouched, also to not displace a large proportion of the existing trawl effort into areas where they maybe haven't been before. So here's a little picture of these are rockfish larvae, and it was a long debate for a long time whether or not the fish were even using this kind of habitat and how much they relied on it. I don't know why that was a debate, but the Fishery Service now, when they sampled corals, have been finding rockfish larvae embedded and within the polyps of deep sea corals. So you could imagine how this kind of like microhabitat can entrain in microcurrents these little fish larvae as they get blown around by the current, and then if they land there, that might be where they live for the rest of their lives, and these things can live hundreds of years. And so, we're focused on trawling here because, this gear type is the largest source of seafloor habitat disturbance in the world, really, and especially in Alaska. So there is over 400,000 square kilometers of the North Pacific has been impacted by trawling at one point or another. This table here, this just came out of an analysis at the Fishery Council. It looked at all the different gear types that are being used in the groundfish fisheries and how big their footprint is. And you can see by far trawling, both bottom trawling and pollock trawling, have the largest footprint of any gear type in Alaska. One thing the Fishery Service and the Council like to say a lot is like, well, every fishery has bycatch, or every fishery has an impact. But you can see like the impact, the square footage of how much seafloor you're affected by long lines or pots are just a smidgen of how much habitat trawling affects. And this map here, it's no mystery actually to fishery managers that trawling isn't necessarily compatible with a lot of other fisheries or habitat management, or there's a lot of conflict over trawling. And so that's why in large swaths of the ocean, fisheries managers have put places off limits to trawling. So you can see we still have most of the Bering Sea shelf itself is open to trawling. That's where most of our pollock catch comes from. Bottom trawling is not allowed to be expanding up north through much of the Aleutian Islands now. Canada got its act together. They've closed most of the deep waters offshore. Same with off the Pacific Northwest. But the Gulf of Alaska is still largely open. There are some pockets of areas that are close to trawling, but the Gulf of Alaska is still largely open and could expand. Gulf of Alaska is also the last place where the Fisheries Service has not created what's called a catch share program, which is allocations of the quota to individual vessels so they don't have to race for fish. So by and large, the Gulf of Alaska is a place where they still compete for a limited amount of catch. And I know you guys are a little behind schedule, so and I have more slides, but I think I'll probably just end in that report I sent around. I know the Outdoor Council weighs in on many issues. These are some policy recommendations that we came up with on what to do moving forward around trawling in Alaska. We'd like to see limiting the footprint of trawling in the Gulf of Alaska itself. Identifying those pockets of really complex structural habitat and protecting, putting those off limits to dragging or trawling, and putting observers on all these boats in the Gulf where they don't have observers yet. I think that was a quick tour through bycatch and trawling, and yeah, open the floor to questions, discussion.
Yeah, so a few years ago, Canada reduced bycatch by, they say 90% in a single year. What did they do to make that impact? And why do you think that Alaska or the United States could follow suit and do the exact same thing?
Yeah, so in Canada, what happened there was they moved to a catch share program. So there was, they gave each boat a certain amount of quota and a certain amount of the bycatch too, but less bycatch than they were catching before, and said, if you want to keep fishing, you got to catch that amount of fish with this amount of bycatch, and that's how they did it. And if guys started to approach their cap, they would have to trade or buy bycatch quota from another vessel. And so it became a system of, if they wanted to keep fishing, they had to do that. So right now, why haven't we done that in Alaska? Well, it's been, the Fisheries Service, the Council, they tend to look back on, I hate to say it, but rest on their laurels in some way. Things used to be worse. There used to be a lot more bycatch and there's less now. But it's still a lot. I mean, it's a lot for many Alaskans to know that there's 2,000 tons of halibut thrown over the side, dead and wasted, when you're only allowed to catch one a day. It feels unacceptable to have 25,000 Chinook salmon be caught as bycatch in the Gulf when Chinook salmon fisheries are shut down. So what could we do? Well, we could, I'm not necessarily entirely supportive, but maybe something like these individual bycatch quotas for a trawler. If they go to a catch share program and they have a certain amount of flatfish or pollock they're allowed to catch, well, maybe they only get 20 salmon to catch that with. I also think that we haven't fully explored, let's see here. Oh, maybe we'll go back to spatial management, that you can identify hotspots of bycatch and critical habitat for species and put some of those areas off limits. I can imagine trawling right at the mouth of Cook Inlet. It's probably catching a few salmon we'd care about, and that's probably not necessarily a great place to trawl. I think it just needs a little deeper dive into what we can do to minimize that bycatch.
I know that you probably will do more studies. It seems to me like there's all kinds of information you have, just sort it through and identify it and say, well, that we don't need more studies. The studies information's there.
I couldn't agree more. Yes.
And these are American trawlers, correct?
Yes, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which is the Federal Fisheries Act, which manages the nation's fisheries, yes, it's all U.S. boats, American-owned. The product goes to China, yes, but some boats based in Alaska, a few. Back on that slide that I showed for the Gulf, there is a catcher vessel fleet out of Kodiak, which leaves Kodiak and then brings the catch back to Kodiak for processing. That's probably closer to the model of the type of trawling you may be willing to accept, as opposed to the factory trawlers, for example, that come up from Seattle, spend their time offshore, and the boat or the fish rarely touches the dock. If it does, though, they do pay landing tax to the state of Alaska. I mean, it's pennies per pound, but it's still there. Even though they have tried to sue the state to avoid paying those taxes, they did lose recently. But yeah, it's all U.S. owned. Big companies, I don't know who ultimately owns them, honestly, but they're incorporated in the U.S.
So
Yeah.
one of the other, I'm sorry to cut you off. Go ahead, Todd. So when you're showing that slide of the coastline and all the areas where trawling was not allowed, what I noticed, yeah, right there,
Yep.
was that the area where it is allowed is the Gulf of Alaska. Why is that?
Well, it just happened to be, so I've worked for Oceana like 20 years almost, been going to all these fishery council meetings. Part of my job is to go to these meetings, read their environmental impact statements, provide public comment, testimony, write letters. We fought for every one of these orange areas. A couple of them were in place before we started working, but not too many. Why is it still occurring in the Gulf? Well, the Gulf just seems like it's the last place where there's not a catch share fishery. There was more Alaska-based trawlers, so there was a little more political pressure to not do anything like that in the Gulf. What else? I think the Fishery Service, the Council, they do like to take one thing at a time. So they started in the Aleutians. They did a few measures in the Bering Sea. They agreed that trawling shouldn't be allowed to expand up into the Arctic. They haven't gotten to the Gulf yet. We've been asking, and we've been working on it, and we, certainly been trying to rally allies to also ask for this concept, and I think that's the logical next step there in the Gulf. There's a lot of shelf habitat there that is far enough away from Kodiak or Sand Point that it hasn't been hit hard by trawls yet, except the passing Seattle trawler on the way to the Bering Sea. And I think we could easily prevent the habitat impacts from that prospecting fishing that's going on.
And part of that too is, Todd, if you look at the map above the chain there, above Dutch Harbor on Alaska, a lot of that area was bought and paid for, plain and simple. If you look at that blue right there above Dutch Harbor in Alaska, one of the counts through that area right there was between 40 and 60 million salmon a year go through that little narrow passage. And that's why it's still like, because it's been bought and paid for by the trawlers. And one of the other things I wanted to get back to, because I started studying this several years ago about why Canada was so successful, mandatory observers.
That's right.
So here's what happened with that. After the first 2 years, they found out these mandatory observers, young biology students like you said yourself, started out $20,000 to $25,000 a year, were being paid $30,000 to $35,000 by the boat captains to shut up. You're going to count 1 in 4. Here's $30,000 in cash. So then they found out, the Canadian government found out they were doing that, made it a felony for the observers to falsify reports. What I think needs to happen in
salary back to the Canadian government. I think it's part of their licensing for the year. So if a trawler wants to operate in Alaska waters or anywhere in the United States waters, part of their licensing is to pay for that 100% observer.
Yeah.
We can all be observers.
They're making that more and more mandatory, Bill. It's not mandatory yet, and it should be. And then the other thing that's been brought up multiple times, and you've already hit on it, I don't know how many tons was it of halibut, doesn't matter. We'll just call it 20 tons. A lot of Canadian boats have gone to, like you said, the share boat. So this guy may be pollock fishing, but he just got into a shit ton of halibut. So he calls his buddy that's halibut fishing, and he comes over and picks up the halibut. They're not dumping it. Or they're processing it and selling it.
Right. So
In Alaska waters right now, as of yesterday, the king salmon bycatch is 16,723 today at the end of February. 16,000 in Alaska waters, and it's February.
yep.
For the year so far?
Yes, ma'am, January, February, 2 months. Over 16,000 king salmon already.
So so back to the observer question though, for a lot of these fisheries, there are observers on the boats, so on the trawl boats. And the industry does pay for those observers as well. So they have a percentage fee that they pay based on the value of their catch, and it goes into the NIMS observer program, and then that's how they get to put observers on the boat. And then some boats, the big factory trawlers in the Bering Sea, they actually have 2 observers on board working different shifts, and they pay those directly. And so the estimates are pretty good. We have a pretty extensive and expensive system of fishery management in Alaska, and that's why we have this perception that we're some of the best in the world. Because my colleagues, like in the Philippines, who work on these same issues without a fishery management system in place, it's very frustrating, very difficult. So, at least we have estimates. That's one. And you may question some of the estimates, like, okay, could be even double, could be maybe 30% higher, less, I don't know, but they're counting them. At least they're counting them. And I know there's ways that they sometimes can work around if the observer sees a salmon or not. But you have to have some faith in the numbers, otherwise the whole system falls apart. Well, yeah, yes.
So are the boats that are factory trawlers, are they, is there a permit attached to them that is like a limited entry permit, or is it just something they pay the state every year? I mean, have you looked at the numbers of maybe buying them out and putting them to sleep?
Right. So a lot of these companies, a lot of these vessels were given the quota during the passage of like the Magnuson-Stevens Act in the first place, right? So there was something called the American Fisheries Act, and then the Magnuson-Stevens Act, and the permits themselves. I mean, these are billion-dollar companies. Trident, is a huge company. I couldn't even think about how you would buy out Trident. But we did look into what it would take to, say, buy out some trawlers in the Aleutian Islands, where there was only like 6 factory trawlers operating, but it was still beyond, the means, $80 million plus, not just for the permits, but the future value and all that kind of stuff. But we have to remember, this is a common property resource, right? So, when you're looking at the trade-offs to the state of Alaska, what you get for allowing this kind of fishing in Alaska waters, well, you get a little landings tax, a few cents on the pound, some infrastructure investment, in the fish processing plants and docks and fuel docks and things like that. They say employment, but most processing employment, they import folks from other countries on work visas to do that labor. And there's a few places like Kodiak, which has a resident processing workforce. But then again, then you have issues with, I've heard stories in Kodiak of people getting evicted from places they've lived for 20 years because Trident bought the apartment building to house their processing workers. So, you know, it's the risk of consolidation, accumulation, and company town kind of, you know, living in a company town. And what do you do when that one company doesn't want to do what you'd like it to do? You're kind of held hostage in a way. So yeah, I'd love to buy them out, but I don't think that's a reality, unfortunately.
You know, the other thing you hit on is the billions of dollars of industry. My godfather, retired sergeant, commercial crimes fishing game after 30 years, and seized hundreds of 100, 200, 300 foot fishing vessels. Seized them. 6 weeks later, you'd see the same crew, same captain on a different boat. And they would banter back and forth on the radio. Joe would call these guys, and, hey, Joe, not gonna take this boat because I'm moving further away from you, blah, 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 blah. And they literally laughed and said it was nothing more than a cost of doing business. Literally, fishing illegally. You take a $12 million boat, 6 weeks later, they got a brand new boat sitting in the exact same spot. And joked about losing a $12 million boat as a cost of doing business.
Wow. So was this back in like the foreign joint venture days?
Back in the early 2000s.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah. Same thing with the seiners. You know, pollock seiners.
Huh. Well, I'd like to talk more about that.
So why don't they, instead of pitching all that fish overboard, why don't they make them process that and give it to the state? The state could sell it and take all that money for more observers, or even to buy them out in the future. They probably have a lot less bycatch if they knew they had to deal with that and pay for it and give it to the state.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's come up quite often. So there are these programs where, and it's called Sea Share, I believe, that is a seafood donation program where some of this bycatch is kept and processed and then donated. You know, they actually get a double tax break for doing that because they can claim the processed value of the fish somehow. Anyways, but it's only a small percentage of the total bycatch that they catch. So yes, some of it flows into food banks, but you know, most people want to be able to catch their own fish, and it's not a substitute for fish getting up the Yukon River or going out halibut fishing on your own. You know, I like it when my neighbor drops off a fillet for me because I suck at catching kings, but you know, it's much more fun to catch them on your own. But people have proposed full retention. So if you keep everything you catch, and that has been implemented in Europe, actually, in Iceland, I think too, where they said, okay, you gotta keep everything. So no high grading, everything comes back to the dock. And that's only working out somewhat okay. In fact, there was a big bust that they found this processing plant in, I can't remember exactly where it was, but it was in Europe, and they had a pipe that took some of the delivery bycatch and then went back out into the ocean there. So, you know, if it doesn't work in the business model, there could be ways they find their way around it. I think we haven't implemented that in Alaska largely because of the processing lobby. You know, they don't want to deal with sculpins and skates and sharks coming into their processing plant. And right now it's also easier to just turn it to fish meal too. So a lot of it goes into the fish meal plant, and then it becomes another kind of product. So, but yeah, that is one of the solutions that could be on the table. Keep it all. Keep it all and have a quota for everything too. Yes.
So do you have an estimate of how much of the state waters is open to the trawl fleet now?
Right. So I don't have a picture of that. But luckily enough, most of state waters and 3 nautical miles is closed to trawling. So the Board of Fish, and you guys are all, the policy is fisheries aren't allowed unless they're allowed, So until someone proposes that type of fishery in state waters, it's closed to trawling. But there are patches here and there where trawling is being allowed. Prince William Sound had a recent pollock experimental fishery open. I've heard some anecdotal horror stories around rockfish bycatch and salmon bycatch there. There's a couple pockets in off the peninsula where there's some trawling allowed. It's called a parallel waters fishery. So boats that start in the cod trawl fishery offshore somehow get an opening to come into state waters and also trawl.
So you don't know?
No, yes, I don't know the exact percentage, but it isn't that high. So it's pockets here and there.
So the idea of closing all state waters to the trawl fleet, you could have some triggers, based on that there are no salmon that are stocks of concern or something like that, or something that the legislature could do.
Sure could, yeah.
And it would have a minimal effect on the economy of the state because there are just those few pockets left open. But without knowing what that number is, and that would be a handy number to know before we went to the legislature.
Yes,
And said, okay, here we can do this in state waters, to set an example, to put the pressure of conservation back on the feds. So there's, that would, would be insignificant, like you say, because there's so few openings, but it would be real significant, as far as the regulatory process and getting the Alaska legislature involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're not the first person to ask that question. We're diligently going through Fish and Game their regional ground fish management reports to find those pockets of open trawl areas and where those are, and whose ox gets gored if there is a trawling closure in state waters. Who would be affected.
Let us know when you get.
Well, I'll be around. I'm happy to answer any questions, chat. Thanks for the invitation to speak here today with you guys.